Good afternoon, everyone. I am delighted that you've chosen to spend your Friday afternoon with us as part of the Careers Festival. I'm Brian Connolly, and I'll be chairing today's discussion on breaking down barriers. What does it take to build a more equal society? Before we dive in, just a few housekeeping notes, and we won't be taking questions during the individual presentations. So if you can have your questions ready for our Q&A session, and you can type those into the chat, and we'll make sure to address as many of those as possible. We're in for a fantastic event today. You're going to hear from our 4 experts who approach the challenge of inequality from very different angles, but who all share a commitment to creating positive change. Without further ado, let's explore why we're all here today. If we can bring up the slides, that would be great. Perfect, and we'll go on to the first slide. So let me start with something we all know, but perhaps we don't talk about openly. Every day across Scotland, talented people face barriers that have nothing to do with their abilities or their potential. Your postcode shouldn't determine whether you get access to quality healthcare. The circumstances you were born into shouldn't limit your economic opportunities. Yet we know these barriers persist. Here's what gives me hope and why I believe today's discussion matters so much. When we do address these inequalities, extraordinary things happen. Communities don't just survive, they thrive. Innovation flourishes everywhere, and crucially, everyone benefits, not just those who were previously excluded. So today's central question is this: recognising those inequalities exist, how can we create a society that genuinely works for everyone, not just in theory, but in practice? Our panel today will share their experiences about the realities of inequality, what's possible when we think differently, and importantly, what we can all do to build a fairer society. If we can go on to the next slide, please. Before I introduce our brilliant panel, let me briefly explain why this topic matters so much to me personally and why I think these conversations are essential. I've spent 16 years working in economic development in a wide variety of roles, including place-based development, exploration of inclusive business models, and exploring new economic structures. I want to share some insights that shape how I think about inequality. Firstly, economic development without equity isn't sustainable. If we want truly thriving places, everyone needs access to opportunities, not just those who are already advantaged. You can't build lasting prosperity on exclusion. Secondly, place-based development must address systematic barriers. I've seen several regeneration projects that ignore the structural inequalities holding people back. Finally, Scotland has the incredible potential to lead globally on well-being economy approaches. Through existing partnerships, we have the frameworks and the relationships to make real progress, but only if we tackle inequality as an economic priority from the start. Predistribution, not redistribution. This brings me to something fundamental to this discussion. True collaboration means recognising that addressing inequality isn't about charity. It's about the foundation for economies that work for everyone. Now, let me introduce our expert panellists, each bringing a unique perspective on how we build a more equal society. Firstly, we have Kate Pickett, OBE from the University of York. Many of you may know her as the co-author of The Spirit Level and co-founder of the Equality Trust. Kate brings the crucial perspective of understanding how inequality impacts issues across society. Next up, we have Oliver Berry from the Smart Data Foundry at the University of Edinburgh. Oliver ensures that financial data research serves the public interest and translates into policy that creates real change for communities. We were due to hear from Dr. Noor Gadban from the University of Glasgow. Noor was going to speak about how artificial intelligence and technology can either bridge divides or create new ones. Now, unfortunately, she is ill today, so I'll be taking you through her slide content. And finally, Professor Jerry McCartney from the University of Glasgow. Jerry is leading vital research on how we can actually redesign our economies to respond to the multiple crises we face, while understanding the deep links between economics and population health. Together, they share practical insights on what works, what doesn't, and importantly, what's possible when we work together to break down the barriers holding back our communities. So on that point, let's start learning from our experts. I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Professor Kate Pickett, who will share her insights on inequality being the enemy between us. Thank you very much, Kate.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you for inviting me to take part in this today with my distinguished fellow panelists. Could I have my first slide, please? So I want to touch first on my research with Richard Wilkinson, which has focused on the impacts of economic inequality. And in our 2009 book, The Spirit Level, we drew together a very large body of evidence linking income inequality, so the gap between rich and poor in a society, to social cohesion and children's life chances, as well as health and well-being. And we showed that people in societies with bigger income gaps between rich and poor are much more likely to suffer from premature mortality, higher rates of infant mortality, more mental ill health, more illicit drug use, more obesity, and that greater inequality also damages, social relationships. So more unequal societies have more violence, higher rates of imprisonment, weaker community life, and less trust. And as well as social capital, human capital is diminished. In more unequal places, there are lower levels of child well-being, educational attainment, more teenage births, less social mobility. And as well as causing a wide range of problems, the differences between societies are large. So just to give a couple of examples, in the more equal Scandinavian countries, over 60% of people think others can be trusted. It's less than 20% in the more unequal Greece and Portugal. The homicide rate in the USA, which is very unequal, is 34 times higher than the rate in Japan. And although the poor are affected most deeply, even affluent and well-educated people have better outcomes in more equal societies. So if we improve inequality, if we reduce inequality, we can improve life for everyone. Can I have my second slide, please? Thank you. So this is our most up-to-date picture of income inequality in relation to health, social, and indeed environmental problems in rich societies. So in recent years, we've come to realize that inequality is a major roadblock, not just to health and well-being, but also to creating sustainable economies that protect the planet. So we published this in Nature last year, and you can see that great inequality is characterizing the societies that are struggling with poor population health, social dysfunction, restricted life chances for children and young people, and environmental degradation. It's these countries that are most in need of a reset, a recognition that things have gone awry, that they're not on a path towards sustainable prosperity and well-being. So we need a new blueprint for a good society. Can I have my next slide, please? And it's important to remember that socioeconomic inequalities of income, wealth, class, of education, skills, and power, those intersect with all of the inequalities that attach to age, to sex, gender, ethnicity, disability, other minoritized and socially excluded identities. And they also interact and are shaped by geographic inequalities of deprivation and underinvestment. And the ways in which these entrenched sort of vertical inequalities of wealth, income, power, etc., interact and intersect with place and demography, that's what prevents us all from having an equal ability to participate and flourish in our society. Next slide, please. I think we've got the evidence that we need to know how to make a better society, and that is by tackling poverty and inequality. We don't need more policy reviews. We don't need more research describing the problem. We do need to move to action. So how can we do that? I'm going to propose a couple of things. You might not agree with them, but at least let's get them out there for debate. There are two fundamental solutions that I think are big enough to really deliver a transformed and better society. That is universal basic income and a wealth tax. Now, it's not so long ago that those ideas were perhaps considered a bit too far afield, but they're right there now and needing to be debated as things that could provide people with economic security and better well-being. And I think we need more forms of deliberative democracy, like citizens' assemblies and participatory budgeting, to get more people's voices into policy making, to give people more power. And I think we need some new institutions to get evidence-based politics and policy making, a National Institute for Social Change, which would act like a social sciences equivalent of NICE, a proper advisory group to government, not just in crises, but on an ongoing basis, and something to parallel the Office for Budget Responsibility that would look at the social responsibility of new investments, new policies, etc. So I think we know a lot about what we could do, and we just need to start thinking about how collectively we get these things happening. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Kate for opening this event with such insightful content. Looking at some questions on the presentation. So firstly, why do you think inequalities seem so intractable, and why don't we do anything about them?
Well, if you'd asked me 15 years ago, when we published the Spirit Level, I would have said we don't do things about them because not enough people know about the damage caused by inequality. And I don't think anybody's got that excuse any longer. I think that knowledge is fairly widespread, locally, regionally, nationally, internationally. So why don't we do anything? And I suppose my strongest answer would be vested interests. Those with power are the elites who sit at the top of our income distribution, our wealth distribution, and they don't want things to change. And that's, I think, why I'm focused so much on thinking about extending democracy and getting more people's voices in. Because I think when we ask the public about what they want and their preferences for the kinds of societies they live in, they are much more progressive and radical than perhaps they're given credit for. And so I want to see more of more power extended to them.
That's really helpful. What do you think are some of the key strategies for tackling economic inequality and some of the consequences from that?
Well, in your introduction, you mentioned that we want pre-distribution rather than redistribution. I think we want both. I think we want, a more progressive tax system, including wealth taxes, that does that job. But I do think that we need a stronger culture of economic democracy that will embed greater equality more firmly within our institutions where incomes and wealth are created, and in society more generally. So I think that's why I'm in favour of those deliberative, democratic processes that can help extend that. And I think it's harder to undo the extension of rights and a shift in culture than it is to undo things that happen in the tax system.
No, indeed. Finally, how do you think statistics and stories can work together to create political and policy change?
I have learned over the years that you need both. I used to think that if we just presented the right statistics to those who've got the power to make a difference, that would convince them of things. And then sometimes they say, oh, no, those are statistics and not stories. But when you just tell stories without the statistics, then people say, oh, we need evidence. So I think we need to bring both to bear. And you can't get where you want to be without having both the powerful stories that light up the statistics and then that statistical evidence base that underpins the change that you're trying to see.
Thank you very much. Really, really helpful, really insightful, and quite nicely building on that concept. I'm going to move on to our next speaker. I'm delighted to introduce Oliver, who will address the concept of poverty and inequality through novel financial data sources. Pass you on to Oliver.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Brian, and thanks, RC, for having me here today. So my name's Oliver Berry. I am research manager at a thing called Smart Data Foundry. If you go up to the next slide. We are a wholly owned subsidiary of the University of Edinburgh. We are what's known as a data infrastructure provider. We're funded by UKRI through a number of different sources to essentially bring in private sector smart data, as it's now typically known, and make that available for researchers, policymakers, and other people who could benefit from having this sort of data. So in terms of what the data looks like, it's our flagship data sets are consumer financial data, which is de-identified, nationwide granular data. It's updated super regularly, so we can call it near real time. And we also have data that comes in on small, medium enterprises as well. So we can really get quite a good granular view of macroeconomic factors and things that are changing over time. We have a professional infrastructure hosting this data at the Edinburgh Parallel Computing Centre. It's the same architecture that's used to host NHS Scotland data, so we have very secure, We keep that secure with an information governance team, a data science team, and close relationships with regulators. And kind of our main goal is to open this data for good. So next slide, please. Our key areas of focus, and these are really the mission statements that drive us, are very much focused on the topic of today. So reducing poverty and inequality and improving financial economic well-being. These sort of go hand in hand. The reducing poverty and inequality side more focuses on the actionable insights we can pull out around our consumer data, and economic well-being is both that and business data to try and see how we can improve economic activity, productivity, and reduce inequalities across the nation. Next slide, please. We really think that financial data is a resource for social change. It's a very untapped resource as well. If we think about how often we've used like online banking for, only the past 10, 20 years has that really become something where this is actually something that we can access now and really sort of leverage for these purposes. There's a lot of fears around the use of big data by vested interests in companies and how that can negatively affect us. So part of what our mission is, and part of what the mission of sort of our fellow data services that focus on other types of data are to really make sure that this is being put in the right hands for social change. So next slide, please. So we are under the Smart Data Research UK ecosystem, which is similar to the Administrative Data and the Health Data Research UK ecosystems, set up as the financial data service. And this is sort of built around that sort of flagship set of 5.3 million de-identified consumer bank accounts. Those have aggregated weekly transactions. We can't see, specific things that people are buying from shops, but what we can see are really clear sort of trends on sort of people's ability to spend, how people's incomes are affected, not just by big macroeconomic shocks, but by smaller shocks on more regional levels. We provide this data as free and secure access to academics, policymakers across the country. And hopefully our goal is from that to allow for this research to, I think, sort of improve the evidence base that Kate was talking about, and hopefully even go further with it to show that beyond statistics that are sort of survey-based and perhaps lacking in temporality, sometimes lacking in representativeness, we can provide something that complements those and really enables us to target things directly. So if I go to the next slide, and if I skip this one actually, I can start talking about some of the examples of projects that where we've used this data to focus on achieving these aims. So we collaborated with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation to investigate income volatility, which is a massive policy challenge with sort of ripple effects across a number of factors that will make up different inequalities and interrelated inequalities. What we did here was curate the data that we held to sort of more firmly understand where people were working in places like the gig economy or other irregular forms of work, how that was then affecting their income and their ensuing expenditure, whether they were able to consistently meet their committed expenditures, their bills, their housing costs, and how that was varying. And then sort of trying to map this across where we have administrative and health data to see what the interrelation with other inequalities was in there. So we hope this is a really powerful tool to try and investigate those aspects. If I go to the next slide. What we've been doing a lot more recently is, and this is a tool for both policymakers and researchers. This was originally pioneered with East Renfrewshire Council, and I'm going to show some quick insights to some of the things that we pulled out from that in a moment. This is it's currently a Scotland-wide map. It will be a GB-wide map. Unfortunately, we don't have any data for Northern Ireland. which allows us to track economic well-being over time. So from our data, we've created a number of categories that sort of indicate financial vulnerability, whether that's having very low cash balance on a regular basis, consistently going into overdraft usage, or having high benefits dependence, or consistently having to live beyond means. We can put that in this map here with a number of council data and open data things that we've pulled from like census. So typically we can look at households with long-term health issues or disabilities, map those out, and we can see how those change on a week-by-week basis over time with people's financial data. And this is about a month lag to it. So we can see right up to the end of August in this sort of map at the moment. So really, this is designed for fast and effective intervention policy making, and also, to really have that evidence base strong, so we can show what's actually happening in the country rather than waiting for official government statistics, which can often be a year or two out of date by the time they're finally published. So if we look at the next slide. So this is East Renfrewshire Council. It's a good test of your Scottish geography. East Renfrewshire is just south of Glasgow, and it's got very known areas of entrenched systemic inequality. They've been, really unequal for decades now. And the council is well aware of this, and due to, I think, to say vested interests, but also sort of inability to act with sort of limited and stripped council budgets. They are trying to help deal with these areas, but don't necessarily know how to. So you can see on the left here, that's sort of the Barhead area, which is a poor area of the suburb of Glasgow. However, on the right, what we were seeing on the back of COVID and the cost of living crisis is that there was very clear emerging financial distress in new areas. Obviously, a lot of these areas, so this is sort of Giffnock, even Newton Mearns, people have over-leveraged themselves to buy properties in this area. There's the classic thing of over-leveraging yourself to buy a property that's closer to what you consider to be a better school. And that entrenches inequality in itself. But because of the cost of living crisis, because of the interest rate shocks, we were seeing that many people were sort of falling into this financial distress, and the council were completely unaware of it, because what the council offers in terms of money and advice services and the sort of other services, food banks, etc., people were driving to the other end of the council, not giving accurate address data, so they were unaware that this sort of thing was happening completely. And obviously, not that we shouldn't be addressing what's on the left, but it's a lot cheaper and a lot easier for local authorities to be able to stop people falling into poverty than to be able to help them out of it once they're in there. So this was a way that they were very much easy to target these interventions where people were perhaps not seeking help because of fears of stigma, and putting results in there. So this is just one key little example of how this data can be really useful in terms of building the evidence base to address inequality. So next slide, please. We've got more slides. That's the next slide. Perfect.
That's it. Perfect. And thank you for a really useful presentation there, Oliver. In terms of diving into this a bit more, I've got a couple of questions.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, what do you feel is the potential for using novel forms of data in researching and addressing poverty and inequality?
I was going to say I don't know what the potential is, but I think that's a good thing that we don't actually know the extent of the potential of this yet. From what I've showed with the little example there and what we see with researchers coming in, there's fantastic sort of obvious potential to be looking at macroeconomic shocks and the ensuing effects on people and individuals and their finances. But there's potential way beyond that in terms of being able to look at specific targeted interventions. So in Scotland, we have the Scottish Child Payment. So seeing what the effects of providing that are compared to similar regions in England where the same benefits are not freely provided, and how that helps over a long term lift people or help to try and lift people out of systems of poverty and inequality. So, yeah.
No, perfect. No worries at all. What do you feel are some of the, I suppose, risks and safety considerations of using novel forms of data for this kind of work?
There are definitely a series of risks and safety considerations. As I mentioned at the start of the presentation, we are sort of fully GDPR regulation compliant. We make sure this is in the most secure environment it can be. We have a lengthy application process and vetting process for anyone wishing to access the data. The data by its own nature that we get is de-identified, so there's very little personally re-identifying information in that data, and especially it's able to be manipulated in a secure research environment, but any outputs that come out of that have to be aggregated to sort of certain levels. So you're talking about taking this individual level data and turning it into sort of useful statistics where in a certain small area, no more than like 10 people, no less than 10 people, sorry, are visible to ensure that there's no risk of re-identifying those and finding out anything about those. We have constant things, so looking at motivated intruder tests and other things. That's the technical security. So the risks of using novel forms of data for other things are the same as the risks of using any form of data for anything. That without sort of, I think as Kate said, the stories that go along with it, it's very easy to misrepresent statistics to reach a conclusion that you're wanting to reach. So ensuring that we have sort of a dedicated ethical and a really theoretical sort of foundation in place in terms of who we can work with and what we want the missions to be. So all of the projects that work with us have to be trying to further those missions of improving economic well-being and reducing poverty and inequality. I don't think it's something that we could ever potentially be able to get rid of completely in terms of that misrepresentation, but it's something that we're constantly thinking about and trying to take steps to ensure.
Perfect. And thank you very much for your time, Oliver. Very much appreciated. We'll bring you back for the panel session. So, as mentioned, we were looking forward to having Dr. Noor Gadban joining us to explore how we can seek to address educational inequalities using AI to drive equity. Unfortunately, she is ill and not able to attend. Noor has very kindly provided some speaker notes, however, so I'll do my best to present these in as engaging a manner as possible. So, I'll go back to the first slide, sorry. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to share how AI can help us drive equity in education. The theme is Smarter Learning, Fairer Futures. And my hope is that you leave today inspired by what's possible. Next slide, please. Before diving into solutions, let's begin with why equity in education matters so deeply. Today, over 260 million children still lack access to school. Out-of-school rates are particularly stark in low-income countries. At upper secondary, nearly 61% of students are excluded. While higher-income nations see challenges too, the contrast is staggering. 68 million out-of-school learners in low-income contexts versus only 5.7 million in high-income ones. These numbers remind us that education remains a privilege for many rather than a right. Next slide, please. AI gives us a chance to close those gaps. Tools can personalise learning for students with special needs, language barriers, or neurodiverse profiles. Adaptive assessments, assistive technologies, even immersive VR spaces. These innovations help learners build confidence. And let's be clear, AI doesn't replace teachers, it empowers them. Next slide, please. Take rural schools, where teachers juggle multiple grades and subjects. AI can provide lesson planning support, data insights, and differentiation, lightening workloads whilst raising quality. Or look at inclusive education. Communication aids and personalised tools help all learners, from special educational needs and disabilities to English for speakers of other languages, to thrive on equal footing. Next slide, please. Of course, AI isn't without risk. The digital divide can widen inequalities if we're not careful. Algorithmic bias can reinforce stereotypes. Privacy, data protection, and teacher training are all essential. Context matters. Solutions must be adapted to local needs. Next slide, please. To make AI equitable, we must design inclusively. audit systems for bias, co-create with educators, and ensure infrastructure and accessibility. And above all, AI must blend with human care because technology can augment, but humans must lead. Next slide, please. AI holds the promise to transform education for every learner, but equity requires intentional design, ethics, and collaboration. So I invite you, explore innovations, share perspectives, and help shape policy. Let's become curious, leave inspired, and build fairer futures together. Thank you very much. Now, I appreciate, obviously, we sadly won't have the time or the opportunity for questions with Noor today, but I am delighted to welcome to the stage our final speaker, Professor Jerry McCartney, presenting on how austerity has impact on life expectancy trends in the UK and beyond. I'll pass you over to Jerry.
Thanks, Brian. Can I just check that you can see my slides okay?
Oh, I think it's still in a conclusion. Maybe the last slide, Jerry, if we... That's it now. Perfect.
Perfect. Thank you. Just shout at me because I can't see you at the same time. So thank you to the RSE for the invitation to speak today, and to Brian for his kind words. I have to say, Brian, you did exceptionally well there. I have a recurrent nightmare where I wake up in a sweat that somebody else's slides appear in front of me and I have to talk them through. So you did remarkably well there. So I'm going to run through really quickly the findings of a book that David Walsh and I recently published, which looks at the impact of austerity policies in the UK and indeed internationally over the last 15 years or so. So there's a couple of points I want to convince you of. The first is that life expectancy trends have dramatically changed over that time period. So this is a very simple graph of life expectancy for women at the top and men at the bottom in England and Wales from 1981 up to just before the pandemic. And you can see that up until 2011 or 12, life expectancy had steadily but consistently improved. But after 2012, that rate of improvement just fell off a cliff, such that we saw almost no improvement in life expectancy whatsoever. That was true in England and Wales, but it's also true in Scotland, where again, from 2012 onwards, we see no improvement in life expectancy and indeed a decline for some years. And just to remind you, this is before the pandemic. The pandemic obviously caused that to decrease further. If we look at particular cities, and if we break this down by area deprivation, the figures are even worse. So looking at my home city of Glasgow, you can see here that the average mortality rate, so low is good on this graph, goes down all the way to 2012 before increasing. But for people in the least deprived fifth of Glasgow, mortality rates continue to improve. But if I add in the rates for people living in the most deprived 20% of areas in Glasgow, for this age group, it has now gone back to the rates of mortality that we saw back in 2000. So 10 or 12 years of progress wiped out in the subsequent time period. So we have a real challenge in the UK. But if we look across the world, that's the UK data there. I'll just move that little thing across. What this shows is the change in mortality rates as a percentage for each year up to the pandemic. And the red box shows that this rate of improvement, again, just went down to almost zero. So lines below the bar here are good. But this is not confined to the UK. So we can see that in Australia, in France, in Germany, Greece, Poland, and particularly in the USA, life expectancy either stopped improving or got worse, as is in the case in the USA, mirroring the results that Kate Pickett presented earlier on, as the US being a sort of almost an outlier as being particularly bad for income inequality and also for this lack of improvement in mortality trends. So what is causing it? Having hopefully convinced you that we have a problem, what I now want to convince you of is that the weight of evidence, and this is all very informed by the evidence base, the weight of evidence shows that austerity is the main cause of this change in trend across the world. So at international level, a lot of different studies have now been done. We know that austerity was implemented very widely across many, many countries after 2010. If you remember, the great financial crash in 2007-8 was met initially by a period of quantitative easing, but then over time, the IMF and other financial institutions encouraged, or indeed coerced in the case of Greece and Spain, the implementation of austerity policies. Even before those mortality trends started to dip, using more historical data, we knew that austerity policies harmed mortality trends, as shown by this really good paper by Veronica Tofaluti and colleagues. And then over time, as the trends started to change, more and more data emerged. So this one focused on European countries, again showing places that implemented more austerity had worse trends. And then we updated this using data up to 2019 with a whole range of different measures of austerity, a much more comprehensive range of analyses to adjust for other factors that might be responsible for this. And we came to the very strong conclusion that austerity has large negative impacts across countries and time on mortality and life expectancy trends, and also on a measure of health inequalities, and especially if austerity was implemented during a period of economic downturn. And you have to argue that the UK has seen a very prolonged economic downturn in which austerity has been implemented. The evidence base, though, goes down to subnational level. So we know that areas within England that had larger cuts in local government budgets saw higher rates of mortality. We know that social security cuts, again, were very, very important in driving these trends. And then at household level, we would love DWP linked data to look at individual exposure to benefit sanctions and cuts to benefits, but we can use panel studies such as Understanding Society, and that has shown that the changes of universal credit, where the eligibility criteria have been narrowed, have led to higher rates of psychological distress, for decreasing mental health amongst lone parents. And then we know that when you combine all of these different factors together and model that range of changes to local government spending and to social security explains almost all the trends in the UK. So to conclude, I think the evidence is very strong that shows that austerity policies have killed a vast number of people across the world, and unnecessarily so. And if we want population health to improve into the future and health inequalities to narrow, we need to reverse the cuts to social security and local government spending that we've seen in the UK since 2010, and more broadly and across more countries, reverse the austerity policies. Thank you very much. And also like to say thank you to the very many people that were involved in producing the book, which is available. We don't make any money from it. All royalties go to the NHS. Thank you.
Thank you very much for some genuine insights into changing health outcomes. I suppose some of the causes of those. We've seen significant impact on mortality trends related to policy decisions since 2010. To what extent do you think these policies have been changed by the change in government at Westminster?
Thanks, Brian. So there was a number of different governments that introduced austerity. So they actually predate in some ways, on some measures, the 2010 coalition government. So there were already cuts to social security that predated that. There was more use of social security sanctions and things under the Blair and Brown governments. But from 2010 onwards, there was a marked change. So massive cuts to social security benefits, a huge array of additional sanctions and conditions on receiving those benefits, and those are the income sources that many people on low incomes are solely reliant upon. But in combination with that, we saw a whole array of cuts to local government services, and that's the things that give us the foundations for basic life, whether that's investment in schools or social work or local libraries. Since the Labour government was elected just over a year ago now, we have seen some changes in some of those policies. So they have announced increases in local government spending over the course of this parliament, but they've, if anything, doubled down on the cuts to social security benefits. So in a Scottish context, obviously, the local government spending is devolved, so that has a consequential for the Scottish government, and they will have decisions to make about how they spend that within Scotland. But there's much, much more to be done, especially on social security, if we're to see those those life expectancy trends improve into the future.
I think, like, following up on that, I suppose a question is, to what extent has policy at the Scottish Government level been responsible for some of those trends?
So it's often quite a politicised question, because you get into this kind of debate very quickly, where the Scottish Government will often point at Westminster and say, well, it's their austerity policies that are driving this. Westminster will say, well, you're responsible for healthcare spending, you're responsible for local government spending, you have tax raising powers, you can fix it if you think that you want to take a different policy approach. So to be fair to sort of both sides of that argument and try and give a balanced view on it, the Scottish Government have done some things within their powers to mitigate this. So, for example, they have raised income taxes in a progressive manner, so that they have done some of the things that Kate was sort of alluding to earlier on, about making that income tax gradient a little bit steeper and using more of those revenues to fund public spending, which means that the cuts in public spending have been to a lesser degree than for the rest of the UK. So that has been a useful mitigation, and they focused that on some of the poorest groups, for example, and probably most famously the Scottish Child Payment, but there are another array of things. They've also sought to move in a more universalist way of the provision of public services. So, for example, trying to provide free prescriptions for the entire population, free bus travel for young people and for older adults. So those are differences in policy approaches. There are arguments about whether universalism is the most efficient way of getting money into the pockets of the poorest groups, but it certainly enhances social solidarity and gives more people a stake in the provision of high quality public services. But I think you would have to conclude that almost all of the policies that are driving this problem are coming from the UK level, but the UK government is not unique in that. So Germany has introduced massive austerity policies. France, similarly, across Spain, Italy, Greece, Ireland, many other countries have introduced it, but it has had a different flavour in different countries, with different focuses about whether things have been related to cuts in what services, whether it's been focused on social security or other services, or whether tax changes have been part of that. So there is more work to be done to understand the varieties of austerity across countries and what impacts they have, but in general, austerity is very bad.
One final question for you. So, taking into account some of the policy challenges, what do you think we should do now if we want to see life expectancy improvements?
So I think that the UK Labour government have got themselves into a bind, because they have made a lot of play that they need to stick within fiscal rules, and fiscal rules are about not spending more money than they're bringing in through taxes over the sort of cycle of the Parliament. And that is essentially a lock-in to an austerity agenda, and it misrepresents how the economy works at a national level. It's not a household budget. You do not need to balance budgets in that regard. If you are investing in public services, if you're investing in people, whether that's on education or people's health, that will generate economic activity that can then be used to offset those costs. And so I think it's absolutely essential that the UK government roll back that wide array of cuts to social security benefits in order to move more people out of poverty, and it needs to invest quickly and substantially, even for the long term, in public services. And the risks are really, really stark. It's not just about health. We've seen the rise of the far right and authoritarian and sort of anti-science perspectives, because there is an appetite for change. People are really fed up with how society is, and the risk is that people jump to the right, as they've done in the past when austerity has been implemented, not least in places like Germany in the 1930s. And so the risks are really, really stark, and I think the UK government has to take this risk very, very seriously.
Thank you very much, Jerry. We're now going to move into a wider panel session with a chance to learn more from across our speakers. I'm going to start with some questions and then open the floor up to our audience. We've already had a number of questions come through, but a quick reminder, if you can put your questions in the chat, that would be great. So firstly, each of you has shown how barriers to equality operate at different levels, from educational experience to national economic policies. Where do you think the most critical leverage points are for change? And should we be focusing our efforts on fixing the system we have, or do we need more fundamental redesign of how our institutes work? So I'll open the floor at the moment. We've got Kate. Oh, have we lost Jerry?
Shall I start? I don't think it's an either or, really. What I think we need to be doing is thinking about how we change systems, and that sometimes means we need to change institutions that work within those systems. I do think we need much more discussion about what our vision for our society is. I mean, I think Jerry's absolutely right that we have this danger of a lurch to the populist right if people feel that their lives are no better than they used to be, or that they can't see good opportunities for their children. And we know that we can provide a better alternative with some of the solutions and things that we've talked about. But at the moment, we haven't got a mainstream political party making that case strongly to the electorate. So I think we have a huge job of work to do, but I don't think we should be picking one thing rather than another. I don't think, we should be thinking about talking just about the economy or just about education and early childhood. I just think we should be moving on lots of different fronts. And I think politically, we need a progressive alliance. And I think that means getting away from sort of two-party system. And I think that's going to become increasingly important in the light of perhaps what we might see in the local elections in England and Wales next year. Maybe we'll get some movement on that. But at the moment, I would back any party, any leader who actually started to talk sensibly about creating a good society, instead of talking in narrow terms and the silly sorts of lock-ins to economic thinking that Jerry was talking about. We do need more vision, but I think we need a lot of people working on this across a lot of different fronts.
Perfect. I'll bring in Jerry and then I'll bring in Oliver.
Yeah, sorry about disappearing off. I hit the wrong button. So I don't think there is a single magic policy wand here. I think one of the learnings that I've had over the last 20 years working in this sort of area is that we don't have evidence-informed policy. Politicians will do things that the public and the public narratives and the media and the power bases within society will facilitate. Now, that's not to say you can't have political leadership where politicians can make a case and use the platform they've got to drive more support for evidence-informed policy. But it's on us all to be active in creating the institutions, the policies, the groups, the power bases that actually allows for evidence-informed policy. So to reduce poverty, to reduce inequalities, to have a different economic narrative. It's on us all to do that. But that's really difficult because there's a struggle there. There's a the people in whose interests a redistribution or a pre-distribution of wealth would serve are not those with power at the moment. And so we need to have an understanding of political economy, of power bases. We need to make friends with our colleagues who work in politics, who work in sociology, to understand how societies change and what it takes to get that kind of different narrative and different approach. And we see that, so we could have had a very similar conversation today about climate change, because it's exactly the same debates, exactly the same narratives, exactly the same contestation that's going on, and the different interest groups are very, very similarly aligned. So we need to understand how change happens in societies better, accept that good evidence isn't enough to change policy, but there are a whole range of policies that, has come up across the different presentations, all of which would make a bit of a difference. If I could say one more thing, Eric Olin Wright had a really insightful book called Envisaging Real Utopias, and in that he talked about non-reformist reforms. And what he meant by that was that there are some policies that create a ratchet because they change the narrative, they change the power bases, and they're very difficult to undo. So Kate mentioned that income tax changes, for example, are quite easy to undo. So Margaret Thatcher radically reduced income tax rates when she was elected in 1979 as a very reformable reform, whereas unreformable reforms are things like economic democracy, it's things like changing trade union power, it's things like changing the balance of civic society and social power. It's those kind of bigger, broader, more difficult to take back changes that I think hold the greatest prospect.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'll bring in Oliver now to finish off this question.
Thank you. Yes, I don't think I have quite as eloquent a point as the past two speakers, but I do think, in terms of the example I showed, it does feel very much like a band-aid on an institution rather than something that will actually lead to broader systematic change. I think perhaps the optimist in me, and this is me speaking my own role and not as the organisation I work for is that potentially these data at a grassroots level, actually providing that context and things in a way that's digestible to them, can certainly help build from that basis some positive change. But what we see a lot is sort of populist rhetoric is very easy at overpowering the complexity of what we actually see day to day in the data. It's very easy to have one line about one thing instead of saying, well, education, health inequalities, housing inequalities, gender, race inequalities, all these things are connected and intersect in different ways that make it very difficult to just explain to sort of a general public as to why you would want to enact policies in certain ways when there seems like a much easier solution and a much easier route that you can go down that's being espoused by certain characters in the UK government, not government, but in the wider political ecosystem at the moment.
Thank you very much. I think a theme across the presentations is that well-intentioned interventions can sometimes reinforce the very inequalities they aim to address. So a question would be, how do we balance the urgency of acting now with the need to avoid creating new forms of exclusion? And what do you think are some of the safeguards or principles that should guide us in terms of rolling out solutions at scale? So Bryn and Jerry first this time round.
Crikey, that's a difficult one. So you're right, there are, history's littered with good intentions that kind of went badly. And some of the interventions that we've talked about, so for example, big income tax changes or economic democracy or basic income, these would be big changes and they would have risks because we might not get the implementation right, or there might be unintended consequences. So one of the things that's often debated around basic income is, what impact would it have on the incentive to take up work, and would that have unintended consequences? So whenever policy, so it's back to a sort of evidence-informed policy mindset. I'm very much in favour of embedding evaluations, for doing pilot studies, for taking a sort of stepwise approach to try and minimise those unintended consequences. But it's also fair to say that we can learn a lot from history. So a lot of these interventions were tried in different countries at different time periods, or are being tried now in other countries. So it's not like we're in an evidence vacuum, and we do not know a lot more than sometimes we think, but we always need to be careful about how we implement things and make sure we do equity assessments and environmental assessments to understand any unintended consequences. But that all needs to be balanced against the unintended, or indeed the intended, consequences of current policy, which is, as I've laid out, killing people on a vast scale unnecessarily, and have been for 15 years now. That is hopefully an unintended consequence of policy, which is not being recognised. So you'd have to do really badly with a new policy to outweigh that. So the risks of doing nothing are stark. So I would encourage a bit more policy experimentation, and urgently so.
Perfect. I'll bring in Oliver and then I'll come back to Kate.
Yeah, so I have an example about some things like this. One of the earliest projects that I helped work on with financial data, where researchers identified that people in sort of a middle income bracket were using their overdraft much more frequently than people in the lower income bracket. And in the context of the investigation, they sort of concluded that must mean that the macroeconomic shock they were looking at had resulted actually in worse effects for people in sort of middle income categories rather than lower income categories. And it took someone to say, well, actually, it's probably because those in lower income categories don't have access to overdrafts, that these things aren't actually available. So you need to bring in people who have that, I guess, the lived experience and have that sort of knowledge to be able to show that there's any validity to your evidence base at all a lot of times. And it's really important because, as I said in my presentation, the misuse of statistics can lead to vast harm. And I'm sure over the past 15 years, with the various governments implementing austerity, there were statistics used to sort of say that that's not going to be a problem. And then the classic, some statistics were redefined entirely to say there was no child poverty and other things like that. So yeah, really important that we're very clear about what we're doing and that we don't barrel head first into making changes off the back of it without really understanding what we're talking about first.
I'll bring in Kate.
Well, we have a precautionary principle in public health, which I think is really helpful. We shouldn't do things unless we're sure they're going to be helpful, but we should certainly not wait to do things if we think they will be helpful. I mean, I'm reminded of the reaction of the then Conservative Secretary of State to the Black Report on Health Inequalities back in 1980. When it was produced, he said, we can't possibly implement their findings, because it would cost us too much money, £2 billion a year, and we simply haven't got it. And he never once thought or mentioned, the costs of doing nothing, the costs that are the damage that is caused by the inequality and the poverty that we have. I think it's almost impossible to think about actually improving inequality and doing any kind of damage, that we could just try a little bit more of it. Let's have a little bit more and see where that gets us. I think I agree with everything that Jerry said about evaluating things as we go. But I think we also need to be confident in taking examples from other places around the world and other places that have tried different policies and saying, hey, that might work for us, instead of thinking, oh, well, maybe we've got to trial it here with evaluation here. Those sorts of things take too long. I've not seen any evidence across the world, for instance, that basic income actually causes people to slack off and not work. People want an income that isn't basic, and they want a sense of purpose in their life. So I think that's an argument that we can probably make on the evidence that we've got out there. We do need to be cautious sometimes. We do need to be careful, but we must stop not doing things because we haven't got the perfect evidence that tells us they're going to be, 100% successful. And if we start trying different things in different places and evaluating as we go, we will be co-creating our evidence base of social policy that is helpful for people.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I do have one more question, but I am mindful we have a number of questions from our audience, so we may circle back if we've got a bit of time. But at this point, as I say, I'm going to just to some of the few of the questions that have already been submitted in the chat. So some of these are directly to specific speakers and some are to the panel as a whole. So the first question I've got here is to Kate. You mentioned vested interest is one of the many reasons why inequality persists. How can we go about tackling this as a society and as individuals?
That's a great question. I mean, some of the things that I mentioned, like taxing wealth and extending economic democracy and having things like people's assemblies, those could all be helpful, as could some of the institutions I mentioned, like having a National Institute for Social Policy. So with our National Institute for Clinical Excellence, if we're thinking about introducing a new drug, we ask, is it effective? Is it cost effective at a certain threshold? And if so, then it becomes available on the National Health Service. If we did something similar for social policy, for example, and said, is a proposed policy effective? Is it cost effective? And then it were mandatory for government to then consider that, or perhaps mandatory for then it to put that to a referendum, then we might start to overcome those vested interests. But I do think that we also need to do something serious about donations to political parties and limiting that kind of influence. We don't have it as bad as they have it in the United States, anything alike, but it is getting worse in the UK, and we do need to do something about that, and doing something about our media as well, and the vested interest lock on much of our mainstream and indeed on our social media. There are suggestions for how we might do that. For example, public commissioning of investigative journalism. So there are things that could be implemented. But at the moment, it is about somehow transforming democracy, because Jerry is absolutely right. Governments don't necessarily move on evidence. If they did, everything would be fine already. They do respond, though, to the voices of citizens. They do respond to what they think voters want, their voters in their constituency in particular. So that's our countervailing force, really, to the vested interests. It's about us all finding and exercising our political power.
Thank you very much. I've now got a couple of questions for Oliver. So the first one is, what is the potential for misuse of this type of financial data, and how can we keep it secure? So tech bro culture is a big worry. So I'll leave that one with you first of all, and I'll come back to
really
you.
is, isn't it? I have encountered people who are sort of proponents of that culture when we talk about the fact that we've got sort of big data sources that are open for good. I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, we are on the technical side very stringent, very strict, and sort of at the forefront of new technology to ensure the data is kept secure and can't be misused. But as I also mentioned, sort of finding ways to ensure that misrepresentation of the data doesn't happen is very difficult. And obviously, people attracted to working in an organization that's trying to open this data for good may have certain political beliefs that will be guiding them across that ethical thing. So even considering whether that is potentially the right approach and checking where we internally have come to these conclusions from is very important. But yes, ensuring that no researcher who seems to be giving that sort of bad tech bro vibe is going to access the data is quite easy and quite clear. And we very much make sure in terms of things like data minimization that all data fields that are requested are very clearly justified in how they achieve the aims of the project. And that the aims of the project are clear and consistent with our missions. It's just one of the ways that we ensure it's not going to necessarily be misused, and they're not going to have a wealth of data that they can suddenly start pulling things we wouldn't have expected from.
Perfect. So the second question for yourself, Oliver, can the financial data held in the Data Foundry help address the problems that have arisen with the labour force survey? So could we infer changes to employment from financial tractions in your data sets?
Yes, to an extent, yes and no. We obviously have things like salaried income visible in the data set, and we have benefits income, pension income visible in the data set. So even though the data are on age bands, so we could still identify when someone's retired or when someone's lost a job and starts receiving either job seekers or another type of benefits. I'm not going to say it's perfect. I'm not going to say it's the most clear thing in the world, and there will be a ton of noise within that in terms of people moving to something like maternity leave, people changing their hours, moving jobs, getting promotions, starting to be paid into different accounts and moving across with different financial behaviours. But yes, and the labour force survey is something we're very aware of. We know that the Scottish government and the UK government in general are looking into it because they've had a lot of issues with ensuring data accuracy and ensuring response rates that are high enough to ensure the validity. So very happy to continue conversations about that further.
Next question, although it's not directly addressed to Kate, how do we move forward with initiatives such as a wealth tax and universal basic income if the governments in power have individuals who just want to maintain the status quo?
Well, we need different governments for starters, don't we? So, I mean, well, one of the ways in which we get change, of course, is by exercising our vote. But I also think we need to start thinking about how we exercise our influence on politicians, our influence perhaps on manifesto development, our influence on their commitments. And there is a lot that we can all do as individuals there. You know, we can go to political hustings ahead of elections. We can ask questions of candidates, whether that's for local elections, regional things, or national elections. We can write to our local MPs. We can join different parties. I mean, I'll share with you at the moment a sort of personal dilemma I have about what to do about where my political allegiance lies. I spent, the years from 2010 to 2024 waiting for a Labour government with great enthusiasm. I have to say in this setting that I no longer 1 year on feel as enthusiastic about the government we've got that as I did before it came into power. What do I do with that? I'm not sure yet, but I'm certainly exploring. There's a new network of people that are trying to influence Labour from within. There's a new lead of the Green Party, who actually was a contributor to our book Act Now, which set out a programme of policy for government. So, what is he going to do? We have Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana talking about a new party, and over 800,000 people are already expressing an interest in that. So there's a lot of sort of shifting sands at the moment. And I think what we all need to be doing is making sure that we are asking questions of politicians at all levels, and we are asking them to adopt and take on board the policies that we would like to see implemented. And we need to talk to one another and talk to our colleagues and talk within our professional organisations and talk to our friends and our family. We do make a difference as people. We do affect the political process, most when we act together, but nothing that we do individually is sort of wasted if we are asking good questions and we are trying to encourage politicians to adopt the sorts of social and economic policies that we know would make a difference.
So I have a question that's technically open to the whole panel, but I'll bring in Jerry first. How do we make the case that all these inequalities are linked, and that money spent on reducing economic inequality will have a massive positive effect on student learning, health, and others?
So, in my sort of home field of public health, there is a theory put forward by Bruce Link and Joe Phelan called fundamental causes theory. And I think that theory holds a lot of water. It's pretty robust and it's stood the test of time. And it essentially says that if you have inequalities in flexible resources, so income, wealth, and power, then that will protect you against health inequalities. But I think it can be expanded to inequalities in a whole range of outcomes, whether that's educational outcomes or social outcomes, because economics really matters. And solving economic inequalities will go a long way to solving inequalities in power within society, because economics, if you're rich, if you're wealthy, if you've inherited, you will gain access to a huge range of sources of power, whether that's buying newspapers or paying for advertising or owning companies or gaining rental income from property or land you own, or being able to invest in financial speculation or gain monopoly profits or oligopoly profits, and so on and so forth. So I've got a huge amount of confidence that fixing economic equity will actually be the most important intervention you could possibly do for all of those other forms of inequality. But getting economic inequality sorted arguably needs power to be addressed. So power inequalities is what holds and drives economic inequalities. And I think that's why we need the help from our political science colleagues, our sociology colleagues, who understand that even better and can help us understand and change that part of the causal chain here.
Perfect. I will bring in Oliver and then Kate on that question as well. I can remind you if that's any help.
Yes, so I can quickly talk about what we're doing in terms of the data space. There are a number of fantastic resources and they're currently being made available by colleagues such as the Longitudinal Education's Outcome Dataset. That's a fantastic dataset that tracks back to, I think, as far back as 2000 and tracks sort of educational outcomes throughout time across a range of other sources. Once you can start linking these, you can really start to see there's obvious correlations and perhaps you can even argue the causations between a number of different factors. And it is very clear that where there are areas of deprivation and poverty, the outcomes are worse. We know this is very obvious. But then being able to accurately argue about how the extent to which how this differs and how different types of deprivation differ allow us to start pulling out some quite good solutions. And the Economic Wellbeing Explorer tool I showed earlier hopes to be sort of very complementary to things like SIMD and to eventually pull these data sets in. I'm not saying, obviously, talking about R1 because we make it, but there are a number of tools that are hopefully emerging that will be very useful. And sort of you eventually get to the point where the case is made. The case is really inarguable because you can really see it so prominently.
Thank you very much. I'll bring in Kate on that question as well.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to what colleagues have already said. I mean, I think the evidence that all of these things are interlinked is there. I mean, we were once accused of having a theory of everything, which, I don't think was supposed to be a compliment, but everything is connected, really. And inequality, poverty, they are fundamental causes of a range of things, and so it's quite easy to show those connections. It's quite easy to show as well that often poverty and inequality has the most impact on those who suffer from different sorts of inequalities. And I set some of those out in that slide I showed earlier. So those people who belong to a minoritized ethnicity or women and girls, but it's different for different sorts of outcomes. But I think we do know that everything is connected.
Indeed. A question to, again, anyone that wants to pick up. If you could wave a magic policy wand, what's one policy you would implement to address inequality in Scotland? So I know we've kind of touched on a bit of this, but bring in Oliver first.
I think it might be 3 votes for UBI, but I don't want to speak for my fellow panelists. But that's certainly where my vote would go.
If I could maybe just come in on the UBI one, and I need to declare an interest here. So I chaired the feasibility study group when the Scottish Government commissioned some work to see if a UBI could be trialled in Scotland. And there was a groundswell of support for trialling it. So there was lots and lots of interest from a whole range of non-governmental organisations, from ministers, from the NHS, from a whole range of people, because the potential for that intervention to make a big difference across a whole range of different pathways, but including economic equity, but also changing the nature of work and giving people essentially de facto strike pay to bid up wages and a whole range of different things, was of huge interest to people. But we decided ultimately that it wasn't feasible to pilot it in Scotland because we couldn't get the agreement of the DWP and HMRC to safely transition people on and off of that. And so there was too many risks for people. So which comes back to an earlier question about policy risks, because we didn't have the support of those UK institutions to do a pilot. But people might be aware that the Welsh Government are in the midst of a pilot, but not universal. So it's a basic income for people who are coming out of care. So it's called the Care Leavers pilot. And there are some initial results of that published, which look to be very, very positive indeed. And obviously that's targeted at a very specific group. You'll also hear a lot of people talk about things like the basic income trials in Finland, but again, they weren't universal basic income. So they were basic income trials, which essentially took away the conditions from receiving unemployment benefits within a part of the population. So there are issues with a number of the trials, but there is a really good review that my partner was a co-author on, published in Lancet Public Health, which reviewed all of that evidence and synthesised it and came to the conclusion that actually the evidence is pretty strongly in favour of this for improving health and reducing health inequalities.
We'll bring in Kate on this. Oh, sorry.
Well, I mean, I feel I had my go, didn't I, really, in my 5 minutes at the start. I'm part of the study team that are evaluating the Welsh Government's basic income for care leavers. I used to say, a few years ago, if people asked me this, I used to say if I could wave a magic wand, I would impose 100% inheritance tax. You can't take it with you, but it could be spent for public good here, which is why nobody will ever put me for public office. I would also, if I had a few magic wands, I would do something about private education in the United Kingdom as well, because I do think that is something that entrenches inequality and entrenches sort of elite capture of power. But I think the wealth taxes need to sit alongside the UBI. But I think Oliver's right. You'd get 3 votes from us for UBI. And one of the reasons is I think it would transform how people feel about government and about how their government sees them and their role. And I just think it could really change the way we feel about our nation and about our place in it, and really change our sense of community and our sense of being in it together with government. So I think it could be transformative along those lines, with a benefit far, far beyond its material value.
I think it is about, I suppose, recognising value of individuals rather than as cogs in an economic system. It's fundamentally about the role of the economy in serving society rather than necessarily society serving the economy. I'm going to bring in a question from one of my fellows at the Young Academy of Scotland. So Daniel has mentioned that the neoliberals, far right and populists have the easier messages. How can we change that narrative? So I'll maybe bring in Kate first.
Do they have an easier time? I mean, they wouldn't have said they were going to have an easier time before they actually managed to sort of get their grips on the economy. What's their easier message? I think it's easy for them to talk about freedom, and I think it's easy for them to talk about individualism and sort of people's chances. So I think our best counter-argument to that is to point out to people that you are not free in a neoliberal system. You are not free to have anything other than perhaps a very facile freedom of speech, but you are not free to determine your own destiny. You are not free to make choices about how you spend your time. So I think that's a good message that we could argue about. I think we've got better messages that are about future generations. I think we've got better messages that are about tackling the big issues facing us, like the climate emergency. So I don't think we're lacking good responses. Honestly, we are really, really lacking charismatic leadership, though. So we could do with a bit of that on our side.
Perfect. I'll bring in Jerry and then Oliver.
Yeah, so I kind of agree with Kate. I'm not sure I agree that the far right or the neoliberals have like an easier time messaging. I mean, let's be honest, they've had to try and convince us that it's in the majority's interest to have an elite with billions and billions of pounds, and that the poorest and most dispossessed peoples in the world who are blocked at every point and come to this country destitute are the cause of social problems in this country. They've got to convince people of that. That's a heck of a message, because it ain't true and it's weird. But they have a lot of powerful backers who are propagating that message because it suits their interests. So I think we have the easier message to translate, because it's based on evidence, it's based on truth, and it's apparent to people. But our challenge is about power, about how we can communicate those messages and get the evidence across and encourage people in social solidarity. But we've done it before. There was the so-called sort of a golden period after the Second World War, where people were so fed up with public services being so destitute that they demanded better of their politicians. There was social solidarity, trade union density increased. We worked together to create a better society, and we managed it. Income inequalities dropped dramatically. Poverty rates dropped dramatically. Employment rates were really high. Income tax rates were really high. We didn't have the power vested so much in elites, and that didn't just happen in the UK. It happened across most of continental Europe and even in the USA. So we've done it before. We can do it again. Let's just hope it doesn't take an absolutely calamitous crisis for us to get there.
I'll bring in Oliver, and then we'll pick back up with another question that links into this.
Yes, I think to further Jerry's point, I don't think necessarily we've been convinced of the line that we should all have elite billionaires and everything from the get-go, but that this has actually been a concerted effort for numerous years. You look at the States, it goes back to the 70s, 80s, where they've been targeting very directly and very strategically things like Supreme Court vacancies and Supreme Court seats. That's been a strategy for decades for them, and the left has just not responded with any sort of coherent long-term plan in that sense. I think day to day it feels a bit hopeless at times, especially with the lack of charismatic leadership. If you look at things like people kicking off about refugees and hotels now. The line from populists is that there's not even, they don't even call them refugees, but that there's people in hotels who are here to take your money, and they're taking thousands of pounds of government money each, and doing it. And when you reply to that, well, no, they're getting a paltry amount a week. They're all volunteering more than anyone in the UK has ever volunteered because they want to be part of society. They've stopped listening to you. That argument is a long argument compared to they're just leeching off of us for thousands of pounds a week. And without that sort of, I think as well as saying about complexity versus something that's not complex but wrong, how do you sort of make those arguments to people that have stopped listening to you the moment you're trying to pull evidence or emotion into it? And that's where I really struggle. But I think hopefully on a larger scale, if we can, try and build movements that pull together and do what Jerry's saying, then there is still a modicum of hope for us.
Thank you very much. I think linking into obviously the point Jerry's made around, I suppose, making the case for change with evidence, we have a question from Dorothy. Now, the anti-science narrative that's on the rise now is very worrying. Can the panel comment on some of the ways we can tackle this? So I'll bring in Jerry first of all. Or Kate's on. Get her mute.
Yeah, it's difficult, but it is possible. So during COVID, I was part of a scientific advisory group for our local Gold Command, which was Bradford and Airedale. And we knew that there was a lot of anti-vax messaging hitting the community, and that we were this was even before we had a vaccine. We were very, very worried that if and when we got one, that there was going to be a huge amount of resistance because of this sort of anti-science messaging. We didn't end up having that problem because we were able to work with local leaders and people who were trusted in the community to work to sort of gather with them to help them think about how do you get the messaging right to talk to people about vaccination in a scientific way. And so it wasn't as much of a problem as we had thought it was going to be. But I think it's difficult. These are messages that are obviously appealing to people's fears. I mean, obviously, long term, we need to do better with science education for everybody so that these things are less of a problem. But I think we do need to think about listening respectfully to people's fears. A lot of anti-science beliefs, they're not there because people are stupid. They're there because, somebody's told them something that they don't have any reason to doubt. So we do have to think carefully about how we countermand those messages. And I think we, and when I say we, I'm talking about sort of academic experts, really. I think we perhaps dropped the ball when there were early signs that this was going to be a problem. And people started saying, oh, well, we've had enough of experts. And I don't think there was a concerted effort on the part of the academy to say how important scientific expertise is for health and well-being, how it underpins productivity and well-being in society, how essential it is. And I think collectively we need to make that case.
I'll bring in Jerry and then come back to Oliver.
So I agree with everything Kate said. I'll maybe just try and add a different flavour, which is thinking about the propagation of anti-science. So if I guess almost all of the audience here will be on social media of some kind or another. And what I think sometimes under-recognised is that the social media feed that I will have, say on Facebook, that tells you how old I am, or for the younger audience, Instagram or Snapchat or whatever, is vastly different for each of us. So whatever you've paused on and engaged with or clicked on generates the next bit of the algorithm. And so everybody's feed diverges and you get more and more of whatever caught your attention last time. And your attention, of course, is being sold in little tiny parcels to advertisers. That's how this if you don't know what the product is, you are the product, your attention is the product. And so people just want your attention, and they can find out that if it's an anti-vax message or an anti-science message, or a conspiracy theory message, or a gambling message, or a pornography message, or a football clip message, or whatever it happens to be that gets your attention, you'll get more and more and more of that. And so everybody's social media feed diverges. And so the conversations or the evidence, the knowledge that some people are exposed to in one part of the social media landscape is vastly different from what will be on my feed or Oliver's feed or Kate's feed. And that is a massive problem. So there's been a couple of times now when I've given a presentation on evidence that we've spent, decades sort of looking at in great detail, and people will stand up and say, but what about my evidence? That's not my experience. I saw this, and therefore that contradicts what you're saying. And it's really difficult to engage with that argument because it comes from an entirely different sort of epistemological perspective, which just doesn't recognise evidence as is or has been known and taught across universities and schools for decades and decades. And I think that is like a really fundamental problem. So clearly education and having lots of people included in education and seeing education through is really important, because of course lots of people are dropping out and not getting through to the end of education, and so aren't being exposed to that critical appraisal tool to be able to assess that what they're seeing is actually really weird. But more than that, we need to think about how we're regulating and owning social media. Is this kind of individualization of news feeds and evidence and knowledge really a good idea? How can we get a common discussion across all of society where we're all participating in the same conversation and it's part of the same rules? And I think that's probably another parallel challenge to what Kate's mentioned.
I'm going to bring in Oliver, and then we'll hopefully have time for one more short question before we finish up. But Oliver?
Yeah, I'll try and be quick on this. Completely agree with what's been said. I think there is a key thing that we miss in just scientific education. In general, we learn about science, we learn about the scientific method. But something I picked up a lot during my undergraduate studies was sort of theories espoused by the anthropologist Bruno Latour and other things, which was to investigate how science can also be socially constructed in a sense. And then that's not to discredit scientific methods and things, but that generally leads to a point that I try and take with me, and I feel a lot more people should think about, which is when I see something online and I either agree or disagree with it, it's why do I feel this way? How have I gotten to this point? What is the evidence there? Where is the evidence from? Would this person giving the evidence have any sort of vested interest in this? And you can go down, it's turtles all the way down in terms of asking yourself the question of like, why? But I feel like we all need to ask ourselves why a lot more.
Perfect. Right, I'm going to try and squeeze in, and if we can keep our answers as short as possible whilst appreciating the complexities of the topic. How do we overcome the problem of short-termism in the parliamentary cycle, so governments only tackling issues that get them elected next time? So I'm open to whoever wants to jump in first. Jerry?
Well, there isn't a quick and easy answer to it, and it's probably not my area, but I think that the risk here is that we sort of revert to saying, well, we need to bypass Parliament, we need to have longer term things that are kind of institutionally based. I think actually what we need to do is deepen democracy. So if the public demand the longer term prospects for parliamentarians, that is the only way to realistically embed this for the long run. So I would call for deepening democracy, more participatory democracy, not less in that context.
Perfect.
I'll just say here, I agree with Jerry.
Perfect. Anything more from yourself, Oliver?
No, I can agree with that as well.
That's perfect. So I suppose at this point, I'm actually just going to close off the event. Can I just say again, a massive thanks to our speakers today. So Kate, Oliver and Jerry. Obviously get well to Noor as well. Also thanks to my fellow Young Academy of Scotland members, Daniel, Dorothy and Hannah, for their support in helping to organise this event. Thanks again, obviously, to the RSE as well for their assistance. And finally, I'd like to thank you as our audience for your questions and attendance today. Hopefully you found this useful in considering how you can address inequalities in your own field of expertise. And thank you very much.